So I bought my new kiln and it has arrived. It's now in my shed. It hasn't been wired in yet, but it prompted me to think that it would be helpful to make a video about the sorts of things that it's helpful to consider if you're going to be using a kiln in your home. The first thing to consider is space. Do you have enough space? Because kilns are quite bulky. The actual kiln itself is quite bulky, but also you've got to think about the fact that there needs to be quite a lot of clearance around the kiln as well. So most manufacturers will recommend that you have 18 inches clearance. Some will say 12 inches, but most will say 18 inches between the side of the kiln and any surface that's nearby. And that's partly because to avoid any fires, but also just to make sure that there's enough airflow to make sure that the kiln doesn't overheat as well. So you've got to make sure you've got enough space. It's not just the kiln itself, it's also all the clearance, because the outside surface of the kiln gets hot too, so you don't want to be sort of having to brush up against that to get past it either when it's firing. So I've had two kilns. This is my second kiln. The first kiln I bought from Facebook Marketplace. It was second-hand. The man who owned it had used it a few times and then put it in his garage, and he just had left it. Had been there for 20 years without being used, so it was in quite good shape, but it was old and it wasn't all that efficient really, to be honest with you, but it's stood me in good stead. It's quite a lot smaller. This one is 40 litres. I was already thinking that I needed to get another kiln because of the capacity. I needed something bigger, but then in terms of efficiency, this just was not running very efficiently. It was taking a very, very long time to get up to cone 6. So this one is new, it's not second-hand, and that feels like quite a luxury really. It's bigger, it's 73 litres, which is about the right size for me. So that is another thing that you need to think about. So you need to think about also what size kiln do you want? What's your output like? If you produce a lot of pottery and you've got a lot that you need to fire regularly, you're going to need a bigger kiln. But if you have a slower output, getting a really large kiln is probably going to be quite frustrating, because it's going to take you ages to fill the kiln before you can fire it. So you just need to gauge how much you actually produce and how long it's going to take you to fill a kiln. And you need to think about the internal capacity, because it's not just how big the outside of the kiln is, it's also to do with the internal capacity, because they do have quite thick insulation, and it might sound very large actually. When you're thinking about 73 litres, it sounds enormous, but actually when you look inside, when you take into consideration the kiln furniture and the insulation, it's really not that big a space. So I'll show you the space now. When you're trying to figure out which size kiln to get, what can be helpful actually is just to construct something out of cardboard. I know it sounds a little bit funny, but you can piece something together using a bit of cardboard that you're just about to recycle, and that will give you, it'll essentially make a cardboard box that's the same size as the kiln chamber, and that will give you an idea of exactly how much space you're going to get. If you're going to keep your kiln in a room in your home, you really need to think about having a ventilation system, because kilns give off fumes when they're firing. The clay and the glaze will give off fumes as they're being fired, and for starters those fumes are quite smelly and the smell will permeate through your home, but also they are irritants as well. The fumes are irritants, and you'll find you may find if you walk into a room where a kiln is firing and there isn't adequate ventilation, you'll find that, for example, your lips and your nostrils and other sensitive parts of skin will become irritated by the fumes. You can either get a vent that fits over the top of the kiln and the fumes are drawn up through the vent, or you can have a vent that works by drawing the fumes out of the bottom of the kiln. I would say that venting systems are quite expensive. They take up quite a bit of space and they're quite expensive too. So that's one of the reasons why I didn't want to have the kiln in my home. I have my kiln in my pottery shed, and when the kiln is on I have all the windows open and the doors open, so there's lots of ventilation, and generally speaking I won't be working in here when the kiln is on. I mean, if you're somebody who needs to be working all the time whilst the kiln is on, then a ventilation system is important, but whilst it's firing, I just do other things. There's plenty of stuff that I can be getting on with that doesn't involve me sitting in here. So you don't have to get a ventilation system, but you do need to have a place where there is adequate window, adequate airflow, and also somewhere that it's not going to, where the fumes aren't going to be sort of spreading throughout your home. And the next thing to think about is electricity as well, your electrical supply. Do you have an adequate electrical supply for the kiln that you want to get? Now, this little kiln was a plug-in kiln. It was just a, what do they call them? Plug and go, or I think they're called plug and go or something like that. Anyway, you can just plug them into an ordinary domestic socket and they're good to go. A kiln that you can plug into an ordinary domestic socket is generally less powerful than a larger one. And most kilns are going to need to be wired in using something similar to like a cooker socket, and they are going to need a bit of, the electrical supply is going to need to be adapted a bit as well. Now, I'm not an electrician and I can't advise you about the electrical requirements that you're going to need for your particular setup. I have an electrician who I trust, who is coming tomorrow to wire this in for me. So I know that this kiln needs a new fuse in the fuse board, and it also needs some extra wiring to go from the fuse board to the socket where the kiln is going to be wired in using a cooker socket. That is the extent of my electrical knowledge. But so what I would recommend actually is, if you have your eye on a particular kiln that you want, and by the way, if you're interested in this kiln, I'll put a link in the description below so that you can check that out as well. It might be that this suits you too. What I would recommend is downloading the spec for the kiln, and then you can forward it on to the electrician that you're thinking of using, and they will be able to figure out what it is that you need and also give you a quote, because obviously the electrical work that I'm going to have done tomorrow is going to cost some money. I think it's probably going to cost in the region of, I'm guessing it's going to be between £200 and £300. So that's a cost consideration that you need to factor in as well. The other thing to think about is what temperature you want your kiln to fire to. Are you going to be working at earthenware temperatures? Do you need it to fire to stoneware? Are you going to be firing porcelain? Are you going to be firing to cone 10? So just think about what your requirements are, and then just be aware when you're looking at kilns, particularly if you're looking at second-hand kilns, I would say actually, because quite often when they're sold it doesn't say what the maximum firing temperature is. So you need to ask the person who's selling it, what's the maximum firing temperature? And also, realistically, is the kiln capable of getting to that temperature? Because this little kiln is an old kiln, and although on the side it says that it's capable of firing to 1300 degrees centigrade, which is cone 10, I can't immediately remember what that is in Fahrenheit, but it doesn't fire to cone 10. There's absolutely no way. It can just about make it to cone 6, and that's partially, I think, to do with the fact that it's quite old. So, you know, ask the person, if you're thinking about buying a second-hand one, what temperature does it fire to, and is it actually going to reach that the temperature that you need?
So the first thing that I had to do was clear all the stuff from the shelves in my pottery shed so that the electricians could fit the cable behind them. This was a bit of a pain, but it was a long overdue tidy up. Then, afterwards, it took the two electricians a couple of hours to adjust the fuse box, fit the cable and the socket.
So the kiln has been wired in now, and I'm going to do a test fire. It's recommended that you fire the kiln just with the kiln furniture in for the first firing, and that is to get rid of the oils that are on the elements, and also just to create a protective layer on the elements as well to increase their longevity. So I'll do a test fire, and the test fire is at cone 04. But before I do that, it's also recommended that you vacuum out the inside of the kiln too, because there is dust from the kiln bricks in there as well. So give it a quick hoover. It's recommended when you vacuum out the kiln that you use something like this with the soft bristles on the end. And the other thing to be aware of is that static electricity can build up in the nozzle of the vacuum cleaner, and what you need to avoid is making contact with the vacuum cleaner head and the thermocouple there, which is basically the thermometer inside the kiln, because what can happen is that the static electricity that's built up in here can discharge through the thermocouples. Just be careful not to touch that as you're vacuuming out the kiln. So that's the inside of the kiln vacuumed. What I'm going to do now is I'm going to load up the kiln furniture into the kiln and do a test fire. But before I put the kiln furniture in, I'm going to paint some kiln wash on it. And kiln wash is basically a liquid that you can paint onto your kiln furniture, onto the shelves, and it protects the shelves so that if a glaze drips onto the shelf, you can remove the glaze from the kiln shelf quite easily, and the glaze doesn't just bond itself really strongly to the kiln shelf, so it's just a way of protecting the kiln shelves. So I'm going to paint the kiln shelves with kiln wash and leave it overnight, just to let that cure, and then I'm going to load the kiln up tomorrow and do a test fire. Okay, so it's early in the morning, it's just gone 5 in the morning, and I'm heading on over to the pottery shed. I want to turn the kiln on early because I'm doing the test fire today. This is the first time I've actually fired this kiln, but it takes about 8 hours and I need to make sure that it's done before I leave. So the first thing that goes in are these little spacers. They go in right at the bottom of the kiln to keep the bottom kiln shelf off the base. And also the kiln posts, subsequent kiln posts, need to go directly above those, just to evenly distribute the weight of the kiln on the kiln shelves. The first shelf is going in. Put it in careful not to knock the kiln brick. Okay, so I'm going to put a little cone pack in that I made yesterday, and these are this is cone 05, 04 and 03, and the cones will fall, and if the middle cone bends all the way down and touches the little piece of clay that it's sitting in, then you know that it's firing to cone 04. I'm going to put one on each shelf. And if you want some more information about how to use and how to make cones, I'll put a link in the description below so you can have a look at some information that I've got about that. I've got some information about how to make the cones. So the kiln has this locking mechanism which has to be closed before you turn the kiln on. It's just to stop unsuspecting people from opening up the kiln when it's very hot.
So I'm just about to program the kiln to do a test fire at cone 04. The current temperature in the kiln room is 17 degrees centigrade, and just to let you know, the kiln has been programmed in centigrade because I'm based in the UK. This kiln has pre-programmed firing schedules called cone fire mode. So I press it into cone fire mode and it's asking me if I want to do a preheat, which I don't, so I set the preheat to 0, and then it's asking me which cone I want to fire to. So it's already saying cone 04, but if it wasn't, that's what I'd type in, and then you press enter. Then it asks you what speed. Do you want to fire slow, medium or fast? And I'm firing at medium. Press enter. And then it wants to know if I want to hold on the end of the fire, which I don't, so I'm setting that to 0. And then all you need to do is press start.
And what you'll notice when you switch a kiln on is that clicking noise. That's normal. That clicking noise is the relays. The relays are the things that switch on and off the electrical supply that's going to the elements. So it's normal to hear that clicking noise.
So the test fire is complete and the kiln has cooled. So I'm taking out the kiln furniture and I'm just looking at the cone pack. Now it looks like the 05 cone is completely collapsed and the 04 cone is just bending over and touching the cone pack clay. So that looks like it's fired at the right temperature. Just take a look at the other layers too to make sure that it's evenly distributed. And that cone pack looks okay too. 04's just touching the cone pack. And then finally have a look at the last layer. And again, that looks like it's fired fine too. So the next thing to do is to do a bisque fire. Some of the glazed results. I hope you found this video helpful. If you did, give it a thumbs up and subscribe to the channel, and keep an eye out for the next video, which is coming up any second now. Thanks for watching. Bye!